This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. The American West is full of natural resources, but the diversity of the land also presents challenges to creating rules that vary with the environment in order to utilize those resources efficiently. Exploring how property rights are created and affect outcomes for both better and worse is the topic of today's show. First, we will discuss how American settlers coped with situations as they moved west and how later federal acts impacted resource use. Then, on the second half of the show, we'll examine how the various forms of Native American land privatization impacted their ability to prosper, or, in many cases, not prosper. My first guest is Dr. P.J. Hill. Dr. Hill is a professor emeritus of economics at Wheton College and a senior fellow at the Property and Environment Research Center. He's the editor of 6 books on environmental economics and co-author of 3 other books, including The Not So Wild Wild West, Property Rights on the American Frontier. P.J., welcome back to Lubbock and back to the show.
Good to be here.
So, start by just telling us a little bit about the diversity of the American West and what it makes it unique compared to situations that settlers had encountered on the East Coast prior.
Certainly. One of the things, of course, is that much of the West is arid, low rainfall, but it's not that way, it's not uniform that way throughout, and there's a very substantial changes in the topography, and so as settlers came, as Euro-American settlers came into the West, it was really a discovery process. What worked? What didn't work? How would you use resources? What was the best way to combine them? What sorts of businesses should you have? So there's all sorts of questions that were really, in a sense, unknown, or very different experiences than the settlement east of the Mississippi.
And so as they moved from the Mississippi, they couldn't just transplant the rules of the game and everything else that they had there, not just the businesses, but how to order society even.
Correct. And part of the thing that makes it interesting is that for the first 50 or 60 years of settlement in the West, there was really not much in the way of formal government that supervised it. So there was an opportunity, some people might say it was a default opportunity, but it was an opportunity for people to try to devise on-the-ground institutions to try to govern how they were going to mine gold in California, how they were going to move cattle from Texas to Montana, how they were going to organize wagon trains going from St. Joseph to Sacramento, California, all of those sorts of things. So without formal government, this was kind of an experiment in bottom-up sorts of institutions.
Yeah, and you think precisely because of the diversity of these resources, is this particularly important?
It is, because you need so much more learning by doing and kind of what I would call local knowledge. It's very hard to predict exactly what agriculture is going to be like, and agriculture varies so much across the West, and it is so different than what was in the East, that water rights needed to be different, production techniques needed to be different, transportation needed to be different. So it was really important that there be the opportunity to experiment and to get what we would call lots of feedback loops, lots of times to tell people whether it's doing well or not. And that required some pretty specific local knowledge, people on the ground.
I think that point that you're making must be awfully important, because I can imagine somebody else sitting in my seat saying, but there's experts in Washington, D.C., and there were experts back then in Washington, D.C. Can't they just tell you the best way to do this?
And unfortunately, the experts, once they came on the scene, actually misled people. There were several doctrines. For instance, people knew the West was arid. They thought it ought to be able to be farmed. That was the experience in the East. And so there was one doctrine was rain follows the plow. And if you just simply plow the ground, the moisture that falls will be released more slowly over time. You'll get more precipitation. Doesn't seem to work very well. Another one was forestation. People looked at the East and said, well, look, when we have trees, we have a lot of rain. And they didn't get the causality figured out well, but they actually thought that if they would plant more trees, then that would increase rainfall. Those were actually official doctrines of groups of experts, university professors, government officials, that were trying to tell people how they could do farming on the ground. Those turned out to not be very successful, and there needed to be just lots more experimentation, and the discovery process was really important.
Yeah, experimentation and discovery by the people with their lives at stake.
Right, that had a claim on what was going on.
So let's talk a little bit about historically how this worked then, as the settlement of the frontier. How did it happen originally under the, is it 1785 land ordinance as people went west?
1785 ordinances as the past the original colonies, as land was owned by the federal government. After the formation of the United States, all of the colonies gave up their land. Many of them had land rights that extended beyond their border, some sorts of land claims. They were conflicting, they overlapped. They gave them up to the federal government and made the federal government in charge of them. The 1785 Act that basically set what the land policy was going to do was predicated upon the idea that land should be sold. The biggest thing that should happen to us is it should be put into private hands. They had a system of doing that. They basically sold it. They also wanted to get some revenue out of it. Land sales was an important source of revenue. So that was important east of the Mississippi, and it was also important west of the Mississippi until 1862 when the Homestead Acts were passed. So when miners were going to California, there was really almost no federal rules about how you establish mining claims. They could do it the way they wanted to. And they did come up with a fairly effective way of establishing claims that made for fairly clear and transferable property rights, and that was pretty effective. Unfortunately, in 1862, with the Homestead Act...
So just before we get to the 1862, then, to tie this back to the bottom-up type of governance that you're talking about, under the 1795 1785, sorry, that's basically how you're describing that it worked. There were no experts, the people on the ground got to innovate their rules, and in terms of settlement, this worked fairly well?
Right. It did. It worked quite well east of the Mississippi because the land was sold, usually in fairly large blocks. And now some people didn't like it because they claimed these were people that were land speculators. Well, economists think about speculators are people that are trying to foresee the future, and you do well if you predict the future well. So they would buy up the land. There was actually, from a large period of time, you couldn't buy anything less than 640 acres. It had to be sold in fairly large chunks. So a person would buy the land, or a group of people would buy the land, they would hold it for a period of time, and then they would divide it into whatever sorts of economic units made sense. They might create a town and plot out the town, different sized farms depending upon productivity. So there was that sort of an opportunity to kind of, again, wait until you could discover more and then try to create appropriate sorts of property rights.
And they were responding just like private developers today who own land and try to devise how many homes fit on there versus park space to maximize the value. So 1862 comes along. You get the Homestead Act. How did that change things?
Changed in several ways. For one thing, it tried to impose a top-down belief on what was appropriate agriculture. It said, we want to give away free land. It wasn't free because people competed for it. They didn't compete for it by paying money, but they competed for it by saying, well, I'm going to have to get there as early as I can in order before somebody else does. So they dissipated most of any gains they could get by trying to rush to the frontier, just living on the land as long as they could until it made sense to bring it into production. But the other sort of a thing was the 160-acre limit. 160-acre farms made sense throughout much of the East and the Midwest. Does not make sense in the West, but that lasted from 1862 until 1909. The maximum homestead was 160 acres. 1909 it changed to 320. 1916 it changed to 640 acres. Still too small for arid agriculture.
This sounds precisely like the rules of the East just being by fiat put into a different place. So that wasn't everywhere in the West, though. We're sitting here in Texas. Texas is a little bit different, right?
And because Texas came in as a sovereign nation under its own rules, the Homestead Acts did not apply to Texas, and fortunately, from my perspective, Texas was able to use a very different land policy. It's interesting because of the 160-acre limit, because it was so difficult to establish rights in much of the West, and then because during the progressive era around the turn of the century, people started thinking that, well, maybe the federal government could handle the land management better. So both the 160-acre limit and then the idea that the federal government would have the experts to do it meant that much of the land was never privatized in most states. So between 40 and 45% of the West is actually owned by the federal government. Texas is the big exception. Less than 2% of the land in Texas is in public hands.
Yeah, I'm personally a big fan of that. So describe kind of the legacy of this, because we see this in the news now of battles between ranchers and the federal government or other interest groups. What's the legacy of kind of the top-down federal government management of land today? That's the legacy of this.
Well, the legacy is that how the land is going to be used is determined largely through the political process. And so it becomes a political battle rather than a voluntary exchange in the marketplace. Part of it is that amenity use has become a bigger deal, and that's an appropriate sort of an expression. People have decided they want more recreation, more hiking, more fishing, those sorts of things out of the land. Ordinarily, in a market situation, the land would be moved to different uses over time through a whole series of market transactions. You go to people with the idea of a voluntary exchange and you say, can I purchase some fishing rights on your land? Can we use it for recreation? Or an entrepreneur says, I think I can take this land and maybe I will take it completely out of commercial production, or maybe I'll lessen the amount of commercial production. But we'll make just all sorts of adjustments that will take account of new demands. With new demands, when land is owned by the federal government, then it becomes just a political mud wrestling match. And so what's going on is people have to try to make their case with the federal government, litigation being as obnoxious as you can in terms of making your arguments. There's not nearly as much incentive to look for the margin of agreement between you and another person if you are trying to do it politically rather than through market transactions.
Because everybody's fighting over something they don't own.
Right.
First, as you were describing this, I'm thinking about the East Coast, and that all used to be farmland, agricultural land too. You can't walk through the woods in New England without encountering stone walls.
That's right.
Nobody builds stone walls in the woods, but that land got repurposed without this type of conflict.
Right, and you don't see that as this huge political conflict, and people don't really think much about the fact, why is there so much conflict over land in the West? And it's because it's mostly not available for private entrepreneurs to take it and move it from one use to another.
So in the last less than a minute here maybe then, could you kind of wrap up, and I could guess where you might be going with this, but what do you think the lessons of this are kind of overall for land and resource use in the West, and how things might be improved on? Well,
I think to the extent that we can, trying to move the decisions to the lower level. Move them from the federal government to the state level, and if possible, move them from the state level to private ownership. Because to the extent that you can do that, then you encourage people to find ways of getting along. And so much of the conflict in the West is driven by the fact that these are top-down decisions.
All right, well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Bryan Leonard. Dr. Leonard is assistant professor in the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University. Much of his research focuses on how formal and informal property rights affect coordination and collective action for managing natural resources. Bryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start by just kind of taking a broad brush stroke of looking at what's the situation like for Native American Indians on reservations today? How are they doing economically? What is poverty like?
So on average, reservations are shockingly poor compared to surrounding areas. So average per capita income on reservations is about 68% lower than it is in the rest of the United States. Rates of poverty and homelessness are much higher. And then if you think about sort of other indicators of well-being, there's surprisingly high rates of sort of lack of electricity, lack of access to running water. So a lot of these areas look kind of more like what we imagine the developing world looks like than what we think is going on in the United States typically.
Yeah, or the United States 50, 100 years ago.
Right, right.
So what are the kind of main theories or narratives for why this lags so far behind?
So the sort of predominant narrative really focuses on kind of mistreatment, intentional mistreatment of tribes by the US government over history. And certainly there have been periods of that. And the narrative you kind of see if you look this up in the popular press is that we've just kind of successively taken more and more of tribal territory and sort of transferred it to whites or to American citizens. And so that narrative really focuses on kind of takings of natural resource and a lack of valuable endowments. But then more recent research, some of the work I've done and others have done is really focused on the institutions that prevail on reservations today and that have prevailed for about the last 100 years as a primary source of poverty.
By the institutions, you mean kind of the rules of the game of how they have to interact then?
Yeah, so both issues of tribal governance and how that interacts with state and federal governance, but then also sort of oversight issues with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and then the actual configuration of property rights to land and other resources, which is quite bizarre.
So let's work on that then. It's continuing the theme in the first part of the show of the rights to land and resources, and dial this back more than 100 years to 1887. You have the Dawes Act, and this is the Free Market Institute that co-sponsors this show. We're a big believer in private property rights for getting institutions and rules of the game right. Well, Didn't the Dawes Act privatize Indian land?
So the goal of the Dawes Act, depending on who you ask, the stated goal of the Dawes Act was to, quote, turn Indians into farmers. And basically, if you read the justifications for this act, it sort of reads like a micro principles textbook that says, okay, if we give people private property rights to land, they'll invest more in agriculture. And this is sort of part of a broader social agenda to kind of Americanize Native Americans. But there's also a contingent kind of promoting this policy as a way to open up additional lands to white settlements. So you get a little bit of both in kind of the political economy. It's almost a bootleggers and Baptists kind of story.
Sure. There's some who see this as a way for the Native Americans to get ahead, and there's others who see it as a way to steal some land.
That's right.
So which did it do?
Both. I don't know that it helped. It does not seem to have helped many tribes get ahead. As a matter of sort of history, the overall size of reservations across the United States shrunk from about 140,000 acres to closer to 70,000 acres, or 70,000 acres as a result of the Dawes Act. So there was...
As land transferred to whites.
So basically, they chopped up reservations into these homestead-size allotments that were about 160 acres. And if there were more potential allotments than there were Indians living on the reservation, they made the surplus land open to white settlement. And so that's how you get this big kind of lopping off of land from reservations. But then within reservations, there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of how much land the tribe retained, whether the reservation was allotted at all. So only about half of the reservations that we have today were subject to this policy, it turns out.
Now, like the economist me at first still hasn't heard like a smoking gun that would make this worse for the Native Americans. So yes, some land was stolen, but when we look across countries, very small countries that are densely populated can be very wealthy. Ones with lots of resources can't be. If the Native American Indians actually got private property in their land, wouldn't this work out?
So it turns out that the way in which land was privatized created a very strange mix of institutions that still persists today. So because there was this sort of broad concern that Native Americans were going to be exploited by land-hungry whites, they put in place a competency requirement. So initially what would happen is the BIA agent would assign an allotment to an individual or to a family and say, okay, here's your 160 acres, this is yours. So it's privatized in that sense. But it remained in trust status with the BIA for 25 to 30 years, or until the BIA agent decided that that individual was competent to be able to sell their land. And so while this land is in trust status, it's subject to a variety of restrictions. They can't sell it. They can't necessarily lease it to whites. They can't list it. They can't make it part of their will. So it's anything they want to do with the land is subject to approval by the BIA. So it's a very incomplete form of property right. But the stated intent of this whole trust status was to actually try to prevent this kind of land grabbing and try to prevent exploitation.
But as a byproduct of it, they didn't get full private property rights.
That's right. And the sort of critical issue here is that this policy gets ended at the national level kind of overnight in 1934. The federal government in the Indian Reorganization Act says we're not going to do allotment anymore. So any pieces of land that were in this allotted individual trust status as of 1934 broadly are still in that trust status today.
So they never got full property
So
rights.
They never got fee simple sort of full property rights. And in addition to that, because they weren't able to will the property, included in their will and testament, what the BIA decided they should do is just use divided heirship. And so every time one of these property owners dies, the property gets divided, the interest in the property gets divided amongst all their living relatives. And so today you have tracts on reservations that have upwards of 100 sort of individual interests in the property. So if you wanted to do anything with that property, not only would you have to get the BIA's consent, you'd have to get consent for anywhere from 5 to 50 to 100 individuals who may or may not even be living on the reservation.
So they didn't even divide it up equally by the heirs then. The heirs collectively own it together.
So yes, that's right. That's right. And it's not a severable interest either. So I can't just sell off my interest in the parcel. It's that to do anything with any parcel, you have to get consent from everybody who has an interest in that parcel.
Now, that leaves us with a few different statuses of tribal lands today then. So
that's right.
This all came in staggered over time. So some of this got really privatized before 1934.
That's
What's
right.
kind of the lay of the lay of the land, if you will?
Yeah, so you have some reservations that basically cease to exist as a result of the Dawes Act. So basically all the so Oklahoma at this time was Indian territory. And if you look at the map today, there's no longer Indian territory in Oklahoma. All of those reservations basically get completely privatized very early on in the process.
And just to be clear, this is privatized to the Native Americans themselves,
yes,
and to white settlers.
Yes, and then ultimately much of the land does end up passing on to whites, but it all becomes fee simple property. So there's no individual trust land, there's no tribal trust land. There are other reservations, particularly in the Southwest, especially in New Mexico and some in Arizona, that never get allotted at all. Just because this policy ends in 1934. So by 1934, the BIA hadn't gotten around to it. So you have large reservations that are 100% tribal ownership today. And then you have a variety of reservations that got allotted kind of somewhere in the middle of this Dawes era that have a mix of fee simple property rights that may or may not be owned by whites, may or may not be owned by Native Americans, allotted trust property that's subject to this fractionation problem, and then land that was retained by the tribe. And one of the other sort of problems that this has created for development is that it's not like you have this corner of the reservation is owned by the tribe and this corner is owned by whites and is fee simple and this corner is allotted. It's all checkerboarded. And so it creates real problems for anything that requires kind of coordination across space, because you might have to deal with the tribe and with fee simple property owners and with allotted property owners just to, create a subdivision or something like this.
And now, some of your own research has looked into kind of the legacy of these different forms of ownership to levels of prosperity today.
That's right.
What do you find?
So basically we find a clear negative relationship between sort of the degree of individual trust land and the fractionation associated with that land and per capita incomes today. So the poorest reservations today are the ones on average that have the most fractionation. And then what's a little bit harder to compare because of differences in land quality, but it seems to be the case that sort of either having sort of retained tribal ownership or ended up with a lot more fee simple property rights, those reservations are better off. So it's kind of these allotted trusts, it's sort of the worst of both worlds, where you don't get the benefits of informal coordination mechanisms and sort of the tribal governance, which there's evidence that tribes did a pretty good job of coordinating resource use before the Dawes Act, but you also don't get the full benefits of kind of nice, well-defined formal legal property rights because you have all these trust restrictions. And so it's sort of destroying the informal institutions without replacing them with something sort of more powerful or more beneficial.
Leaving you in kind of an in-between vacuum where Washington, D.C. has to do it for you.
That's right. That's right.
And you've actually tried to sort out a little bit of how much of the difference is due to good land or not land. I know, isn't it the sequence, like when they were allotting land, they wanted to allot the good land
That's right.
first?
So one of the things we find is kind of this interesting U-shaped relationship between how much prime agricultural land a reservation had in 1880 and what their per capita income looks like today. And basically what you find is that reservations with either very little prime land or with a lot of prime land are doing fairly well today, at least on average, and it's reservations with kind of a mediocre 40 to 50% prime land that are actually the worst off. And our intuition for that is basically that those reservations that had very good land were allotted right away, and so they are mostly fee simple property rights, kind of what we would think of as being beneficial, and so they kind of got the benefits of good privatization, you might say. Those reservations that had no prime land, so again, we're thinking kind of New Mexico, the Southwest here, were never allotted. And so they don't get the benefits of privatization, but they're also not exposed to all these problems associated with allotted trust lands. But those reservations that were not good enough to allot right away, but sort of got allotted in the 1910s, 19-teens on average, are the ones that have a lot of fractionation. And those are also the ones that earn the lowest per capita incomes today. So for some subset of reservations, and I think this applies to about half the reservations we look at, having more prime land is actually associated with worse outcomes today. That is, they're in this kind of downward sloping part of the U.
Precisely because you're finding it's the rules of the game that
right.
most determine the prosperity, and that's the baggage that came with it.
That's right.
Well, great stuff. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
On today's show, we first learned how settlers, as they were moving west across this country, innovated new rules of governance and ways of doing business and farming to cope with the unique circumstances of the resources and rainfall and other things in the vast American West. And then how later, often rule of experts from Washington, D.C., who know best, created different rules that didn't correspond to the unique situations on the ground and actually screwed things up for them. The second half of the show, we've learned that this situation isn't unique to the white settlers, but also to the Native American Indians on their reservations. As land was privatized to mobilize some of this local information on the ground from the Native Americans so that they could prosper too, it wasn't done in a very good way and often left them without control and generated worse outcomes. In fact, in both of these situations, we see legacies of these problems today of conflict over resource use in the American West and persistent poverty on Native American reservations. I suspect in both cases, a greater move to true privatization and local control could improve the outcomes. We'll see you next time.